Great. Okay, so I will take down my little post note that reminds me to record and welcome everybody to our class on unraveling your DNA test results. The presenters today are myself, Eva Doherty Gremmert. We have Zack Daugherty and Michael Lacopo. So, and in our background support, we have my sister, Rosie Doherty Gremmert. And yes, that's not a typo. We're sisters married to brothers. And we have Kathleen Travers. So Kathleen is in Scotland, so she's helping us from afar. I'm in Carnation, Washington, and many of our attendees are from all over the world. There's quite a few people who signed up for this class. Many of them I know are waiting to get the recording, so I'll be sending that out to everyone. Maybe later today, maybe tomorrow, maybe Monday. You know how things go. So I will get it in the link to you in your email. So to jump right in, I want to invite everyone to make sure that you're muted. And Rosie, do you see in that chat there that she can't find the link? Do you have the link to this class that you could? I don't know. Maybe somebody has emailed me separately, and I don't know how I'm going to handle it.
I'll work on it. You just keep moving forward.
Okay, but I think it just came into the Doherty email. So, yeah. So we're gonna get started here. If you need to take a break, feel free to step away. We were talking before we actually started the class about the different terms that are sort of popular now. One is called bio break, comfort break. So whatever, if you need to, just make sure that you're on mute and, you know, turn your camera off if you happen to take your device with you. I was on a call, and Rosie mentioned it too, where someone accidentally forgot that they were on a call and took their device with them into the facility. So none of us wants to do that. So anyways, so do you know who you are? Well, this has been sponsored by the Association of Dohertys, but as with most things, there's many people with different surnames who are interested in their DNA. So this class is open to all. I'll just jump in here. Let's see. There we go. A few things we wanted to bring up at the beginning was there's some charts you should be keeping track of, even if you have done your DNA test and you're looking at your DNA results based on the company that you did your test with. Build a pedigree chart where you have yourself in the middle. This one is listed Sir Ernest Henry Shackleton and his wife Emily Mary Shackleton, and their kids are to the left, and his parents are to the upper right, her parents to the lower right. Anyways, that's how a pedigree chart works. So we recommend that you build a pedigree chart. It's just direct line ancestors on a pedigree chart. The other chart we recommend you keeping, whether again it's in a computer program or on paper. I've been doing family history long enough that everything I had was on paper. So a family group record is different than a pedigree chart because it's just one particular family. The husband is typically at the top, wife second, and the children listed after. And you can add multiple pages for children because a lot of Irish families had more than 4 kids. So so this has information on the individual people. It will also, for the father or for the husband and wife at the top, the father and mother of this family will typically list their parents' names as well and have their marriage information. Different family group records have different information on them, so you can find samples by Googling family group sheet, family group record, and find one that fits your needs, or use the computer program you're using that has that. I also recommend keeping a research log. The reason I do that, and to me, these are the 3 basic forms of any kind of family research, is the pedigree chart, the family group record, and your research log. I don't know about you, but as I go through the years, I can't always remember, even sometimes earlier in that day, who I'd looked up, where I'd looked, what I'd done. And so it's really important. You can now keep these electronically. You can keep them on paper. but they're usually done by individual. If you're in a software program, you would probably have an individual ID, an individual record that you can put on there. And it's important to track the results. Not only did you find something looking at that particular census record or that particular other source, or if you didn't find anything, write down that you already looked at it. One of the features I like about some of the online software that you could do research with, it will tell you already looked at that today or yesterday, and that's also helpful too. But those are the three pages that we recommend. So basically, the idea that I heard from someone is, my granny said we were Irish, but my DNA doesn't agree. And they wanted to know why they weren't showing up with having any DNA. And for those of you that have done Ancestry DNA, they came out with new percentage numbers a couple of days ago. And so, and what that means is you do inherit 50% from each of your parents, but you don't necessarily inherit as exact 25% from your grandparents, 12.5% from your great-grandparents. You can, within a couple of generations, not have any DNA from one of your ancestors. It doesn't mean you don't have that heritage. It doesn't mean you're not related to that person. It just means in the way that the DNA recombines with each individual child that you might not share that DNA. And when I try to explain this to people, I say our siblings share parents with us. We each get 50% from each parent. But my siblings and I don't all look alike. There's similarities between us, but we have different color hair. We have different color eyes. We have different body shapes. So some of these things are different. My sisters are both way taller than me. I'm the shrimp, even though I'm the oldest. So there's lots of things that are impacted with the DNA. And even though we share parents, we don't have the exact same DNA. So, and of course that's logical. We all know that, but we oftentimes anticipate that this is what we think our DNA should look like. So that's listing you at the bottom. And again, like I said, you do get 50% from each of your parents. But I have this as a chart just to show you, this is what most people think is happening with their DNA, but actually this is what really happens with DNA. So to just show you this chart a little bit more, it's color coded by, and we have way more pieces of DNA than just 6. So, but it's just trying to make this simple. So Andrew is in green and Sandra is in pink. And you can see in their child, Edward, he has half green and half pink. And then on the other side, we have Graham and Elaine. Graham is blue and Elaine is yellow. And Angela has half blue and half yellow. Well, when you get to the 3 children of Edward and Angela, you can see where some of them have blue and they all have a bit of blue, they all have a bit of yellow, and there's some pink in there, but Reagan doesn't have any green. So in other words, Reagan has no DNA from her paternal grandfather. So like I said, the DNA combination is a lot more complicated than this. However, I like this simplistic example of how the DNA can recombine in different siblings. Do we have any questions about this? I am not able to see the chat right now.
There's none in the chat yet, but I did
Great.
invite people to put them in there when they pop up for them.
Great, great. And if you haven't, most people have been well used to Zoom, but if you haven't found the chat yet, there's a button on the bottom that you can click to open up the chat. So Zach, you were going to talk to us about centimorgans.
Yes, it's basically just a simplification of what it is it's a more or less a measure of how related you are. It's more complicated than that, dealing with recombination events, but what you basically should know is that it's basically like a tape measure on how closely related you are. The higher the number of centimorgans, the closer the match is. So the way that this chart works is you could see yourself there in a bold box. and then how much centimorgans and a range of centimorgans and an average that you would have with, say, a first cousin to the right, a sibling to the left, half sibling. Now, some of these relationships will be more or less comparable to one another. You could see how a niece or a nephew is an average of 1744 centimorgans, whereas a half sibling is 1753 centimorgans. And I seen a question not too long ago where someone was like, "These DNA tests don't work. They're saying that my niece is a half sibling." Well, it doesn't know. It's not smart enough to know where she was born, who her parents were. It's just seeing that measure of centimorgans that are shared between himself or herself and their niece, and what the company is thinking is a half sibling, for example. So some of these relationships, just because of the distance and how they work out, will have overlapping ranges. That's more or less where you need to start to apply your genealogy and your knowledge. For example, you're not going to probably have someone that was born 50 years after you be a great aunt or an uncle to you. You know, you need to work out some of these known facts and apply that to something like this chart that is more or less built on a bunch of users sharing what data they know with what relationships they have with some of their matches.
But you
But
had an interesting situation in your family history where someone had a child very late in life. So that gave you,
right. Right, yeah, that's another good point is I had a fourth great grandfather on my Doherty side, my Doherty grandfather, and he had four wives. He was a three times widower, and him and his fourth wife, she was also a widow herself. She was in her early 40s. They ended up having a child when he was 77 and she was 43, I want to say, and that child was a surprise to them, I imagine, and he ended up actually passing away before she was born. But her descendants actually are her grandchildren, I should say, are alive today, and I raced to make sure to DNA test those individuals because they're like a generation out of time. They are higher up on this chart, kind of like this chart you could see. So they're making matches to some interesting individuals. It'd be like me going back in time and testing my great grandfather who died in the 1990s. These individuals, they're at that same generational level as like my great grandparents or most people that died by, like I said, the 1950s or the 1980s. So that's some interesting scenarios you could think about, but always testing the higher generation is ideal when dealing with autosomal tests like this.
and do you want to talk a little bit about when we find someone who's matches us on 7 centimorgans or 10 centimorgans?
Yes. So if you end up having really small matches, that you could fish around and find a countless amount of matches that are, say, below 10 centimorgans. They could be true, but they could also be sort of like false positives in a way. Um, in that there's a thing called identity by descent. I don't want to get too much in it, and then and what that is what we're mostly looking for. But then there's more or less DNA that we share because we belong to certain ancient populations, like regional populations of Western European, for example, and those are certain segments that we end up overlapping on and we're matching on, and it's best to try to not dwell on those too much. I always recommend trying to work on your highest centimorgan matches first, especially the ones you don't know, and narrowing down from there. But I never recommend going to some of these companies. Like there's one company called GEDmatch that allows you to drop the threshold levels and start fishing for those, and then try not to do any confirmation bias of like, oh, I match this person at 5 centimorgans. They have this ancestor that I have that we're not for sure about the genealogy, but it's got to be that, you know. Try to avoid those scenarios in my mind, and focus on those higher centimorgan matches. I mean, what I usually work on is 20 or up, but unless there's certain situations that I'm really dwelling on someone that's really low, that's my basic rule of thumb when talking about those really tiny matches.
Yeah, and if I can interject, and so
Yeah.
As an intro for the people here, my name is Michael Lacapo. It is an Italian surname, but my maternal grandfather's a Doherty, so I'm not an imposter, I swear. But just to reiterate, and of course, this DNA class, since we have a lot of people attending of different levels of experience, we didn't want to do too deep of a dive, but this is really good information. And just to reiterate what Zack said, the amount of centimorgans you share, the higher the amount you share, the more definitive the relationship. So if you share 50% of your DNA, it's got to be a child, a parent, or a sibling. But as you drop, and you drop pretty quickly beyond third cousins, you've got to use your brain, just like Zack said. It's like, is it, an aunt and uncle, or is it a niece or nephew? And you figure that out by an age difference, etc. But as you drop lower and lower and lower, that interpretation can be very nebulous. And so, yeah, like Zack said, if you're really dwelling on an 8 centimorgan match, just because they have Doherty in their family tree does not mean that's where you connect. Those are tiny matches that often, unless you're doing a deep dive, you tend to want to ignore. My guideline too is really look at those 20s and above, but there have been studies showing that even a 20 centimorgan match can generate many generations ago. So sometimes you won't find those matches either. But concentrate on the big ones, kind of let the tinier ones, like in the single digits, fall by the wayside for now. But yeah, they are a unit of measurement of how closely you're related. So, and this chart can help you kind of give you an idea of like, oh, I share, 40 centimorgans. Where would I likely fall in that scenario? So yeah, they're important units of measurement, but don't get too caught up on the tiny ones.
And would you like to talk about pedigree collapse, or Zack, would you want to bring one of the two of you or both of you? That happens commonly in Ireland.
Yeah, that's a good point. So if you end up having multiple Dohertys in your family tree, or you come from a small rural area where there's lots of cousins intermarrying repeatedly, you are going to share a larger amount of DNA with people. So maybe, you've got a third cousin, but he's also a fourth cousin once removed, and he's also a fifth cousin, and he's also a sixth cousin twice removed. That's going to increase your level of DNA match. And so that can throw you off in that you're like, oh, I share 60 centimorgans, so I should be able to figure this person out because they should be a close relative. But they're really a distant relative numerous times over. So there is an additive effect when you have multiple families intermarrying over long periods of time. It's a big problem in Jewish genealogy because the Jewish people have been intermarrying within a small population for centuries. So sometimes their matches look closer than they really are. So same thing will happen if you've got lots of cousin intermarriages in a small rural area.
And that did happen a lot. Yeah. Zack, did you have any other comments about this slide? I can't hear you.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Or-
Yeah, no, nothing. Just I've experienced like working. Just an anecdote of my mother or my father-in-law's grandparents. I were lucky enough to test before they passed away, and they were both from a small island off the coast of Croatia, and I see that where they're like fourth cousins to each other. They don't know how, but of course they're actually much further away, distantly related, but they share like multiple fifth and sixth great grandparents, and because of that, that DNA amplified, that centimorgan rate is higher between them, and that's a case of pedigree collapse that happened, in the 1700s a few times in various different lines. So that will make two people appear more closely related than they are, but that again goes back to trying to apply some level of genealogical investigation overlapped onto some of these DNA tests when possible, unless if it's something that's multi generational, like Michael alluded to with the Jewish population, for example.
I guess I can, without doing too deep of an analysis, sometimes you can tease those apart, because if the site tells you share 40 centimorgans with someone and it's two segments of 20 each, that's often, it indicates a more close relationship than if you had like 10 4 centimorgan matches. Like, so if they're split into tiny pieces, the conglomerate number's big, but it may be more distantly related. So that's getting into a little more deep dive and analysis, but that's sometimes a way you can tease them apart. Yes, a fewer number of big segments versus a lot of little segments can make a difference.
Yep. So let me go to the next slide, Zach, for you. There we go.
Okay, well, this is kind of reiterating what Eva mentioned with the example of the colored blocks and inheriting, but DNA is passed down randomly, or at least when you're talking about multiple generations, when we're discussing some of this autosomal DNA. And you of course will only inherit, 50-50 from your mother and your father. And that will be a different 50-50 mix more often than not for each child, unless if they're identical twins. Um, but beyond that, those percentages become averages of 25% from each grandparent. I've seen as low as 18%, and sometimes higher, closer to 30 on some grandparents. And that's just because of the random nature of some of the recombination events during the DNA being passed down through these generations. So it is a bit difficult, and that's why I mentioned on that last chart those ranges you see. So it's not always pinpoint precision. It takes, like, again, applying those other levels of knowledge of genealogical investigation to that to try to suss out likelihoods more than exact relationships. And in terms of the DNA of neighboring regions, they will look similar if those populations have been in the same region for a while. That's sort of what they base those admixture percentages on.
All right.
No, that's all right.
I'm trying to go backwards. There we go.
And that's when everyone usually often goes and does the autosomal DNA tests from these companies, whether they be Ancestry, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, Family Finder. They love seeing the ethnicity estimates, those percentages. What percentage am I of this, that, or the other? And those are based on, of course, reference populations of what those companies believe were representatives of that region for multiple generations. However, those change. They change those reference populations from time to time, and they change the statistics that they use on your DNA to see how much of that population you're sharing DNA with. So that's why we kind of get the estimates changing and morphing over within a company and between companies, for example. So that always is sort of a work in progress. Ideally, it could be more accurate over time, but it's also something I personally don't dwell with. I look more at those centimorgan matches with certain cousins, and then investigating their genealogy and my genealogy, and seeing if we overlap in certain interesting ways. So I do appreciate that's usually the major selling point of these tests, but it's also something I'm not usually dwelling on myself. But that's pretty much what I have to say about ethnicity or admixture percentages.
Yeah, and do you want to just talk a minute about how neighboring regions, the DNA can look very similar?
Well, for instance, one example that I see, and Ancestry likes playing a game of what I say Pong with my Scotland and Ireland DNA. Like, one year I'm like 18% Irish, and then like a couple days ago it went down to like 4%, and then it all went into Scotland. They keep bouncing around each year, and that's because I have DNA that's the subregion is sort of in the northern end of Ireland, and then the southwest of Scotland. Well, there's a deep history, if you know about the history of that, of traffic and migrations moving between those two areas. Um, for instance, the Battle of the Book is like an old historical account of a saint that traveled to from Donegal, that traveled to southwest Ireland and set up a church there. I forget what the exact island was, or what the saint's name is, but that's it's called the Dalriada Kingdom, for example.
Then you're
And
talking about, yeah, Colin Kill.
yes,
Went
yes,
to
that's it.
Iona. Yeah.
Yep, Iona, and a lot of people migrated with them, for example, and so those populations are neighboring, and they obviously intermix for quite a while. So it's really hard for those companies to sort of suss out and pull out, like, oh, you're really Irish or you're really Scottish. Well, they didn't know those boundaries, in those different times. So So that's why you get some of these neighboring regions usually intermixed or difficult to really pull apart when they're looking at these sort of things and applying those admixture percentages.
Yeah, and for a while there, they were saying I was, well, I don't, Rosie, I don't know Rosie's results, but I was Indonesian for a little while, but I no longer am Indonesian, so.
That's a pretty far region.
I know. I'm not quite sure how that happened, so.
Yeah, so the bottom line is don't get hung up on ethnicity. It's a great little game. It does change. It gets better, and it usually is representative of what you know, but there can be some oddball results. So yeah, it's fun, but it changes. I just, with the new update, they had me at 20% Swedish and Norwegian, which I have no Swedish and Norwegian ancestry, and then this new update dropped me to 0. So so sometimes there's no rhyme to reason.
Yeah. Our neighbor always told us that we should be Norwegian because of the Vikings and not really Irish. So for a period of time, we were 4% Norwegian, but we're not anymore. So,
well, that's a good point, because the companies are using reference samples of usually present day population. So when you have so much movement in and around Europe, in and out of the British Isles, you will get what seems like wrong results, but a lot of people get Northwestern Europe that have English ancestry, and there's movement of Saxons. And so your ethnicity should represent like the last 500 years of your ethnicity. And, trying to put a political boundary name on an ethnicity can sometimes just create problems. So, what really is Swiss, what is German, what is, English, what is Scottish, what is Irish? I mean, the reference populations are people who are representative of recent times, not ancient times. And that's always going to screw up your ethnicity report.
yeah. Yeah, and to just second what Zach said too, I think using the DNA results as a way to augment your family history research is wonderful. It's a great tool, but doing one without the other, either way, I think you're missing out. So I think this is important. So let's talk about the 3 types of tests. Zach, you mentioned autosomal. Do you want to go through those and talk about that?
Sure. So mostly of what we've been talking about in these previous slides is the more common test of autosomal DNA, and that's what the companies that sell those, for instance, is 23andMe for the most part. I know it says 23 and autosomes there's 22, but for the most part it's focused on autosomal DNA. So 23andMe, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA does a bunch of different tests, but they sell one called Family Finder that also is autosomal. And that looks at the 22 autosomes or chromosomes where you inherit one pair from your mother, one pair from your father. It is pretty good at determining some relationships, like we mentioned before with that chart where you could see, for example, siblings, nieces, nephews, first cousins, second cousins, but even getting out to third cousins or beyond, it could be a little bit more difficult. Like that's where those ranges start to widen on the centimorgans you're starting to share because of that randomness of recombination throughout the generations. So why we mention that is because it sort of has a reliable depth, if you want to call it that, up your pedigree chart, where after what this is showing about 5 to 7 generations, you start to really get some small bits of autosomes that you're inheriting that far back, where to land on a match that shares that same small bits, it might be kind of difficult to find. So that's why we're saying the reliability of reaching too far back with it starts to really weaken the further back you go up that generational ladder. So that's one thing to be cognizant of with autosomal tests. It's the first one I recommend if anyone's wanting to start to apply DNA to their genealogy research, because there's a lot of work you could do, believe it or not, and a lot of interesting things you could find when you're just investigating second, third, and fourth cousin level matches, which you will generate a lot of. And it is the most common type of DNA test out there, so your chances of fishing or catching some very cool fish, to put an analogy to it, for your genealogy research is going to be pretty high. That goes into these uniparental DNA tests, which have sort of some unique factors. That one of I'm going to talk about a bit is Y-DNA, and that's a patrilineal DNA. So it has a very unique inheritance pattern where it's not going to diminish over those generations. In fact, it's follows only the male line, but each father passes to his sons all 100% of his Y-DNA. There's no 50% degradation each generation or anything like that. So you will, all the way back to 200,000 years ago, inherit 100% of the Y-DNA up that unbroken patrilineal or father's line. Now, over those generations, it picks up small mutations to where two men that are, say, 50,000 years split apart from their common ancestor on that line, their Y-DNA is not going to quite look the same because of those generational changes over time. So it a little bit shifts, but it's very slow. And because of that feature, it makes it pretty interesting when you're doing like surname research, let's say, if you happen to have access to be able to do that type of test on a male inheritor of that patriline DNA. On the flip side, there's the mitochondrial DNA,
Well,
which,
just before you go to that, put
sure,
in a little plug about our study, since a lot of people on this call have Doherty as a surname.
right. And I recognize some names of some people that have already done Y-DNA tests in here, but the Doherty surname project, for instance, looks at Y-DNA of various male Doherty testers. And what's unique about, I would say, that surname project, out of a lot of them at Family Tree DNA, is we're probably one of the better tested ones out there. And I'm talking about all variants of the name, right? Because you've seen multiple spellings of the surname. And it's one of the better ones tested out there. And what's another unique factor about it is most of the individuals that are tested are related on that line. Whereas if you look like at the Smith surname project, it's going to be all over the place. Or I also am a administrator of the Potter surname project. Well, Potter is a occupational surname, right? So it makes sense that you're going to have a bunch of different unrelated Potter lineages of Y-DNA scattered about. But the Doherty project, for the most part, it does have some of those subgroups that aren't related, and there's all kinds of interesting histories that are left to explore of why that could be. But for the most part, a vast majority of individuals are related on that line since about 800 AD, and definitely more so since 1200 AD. So it's a rather interesting surname project that's always growing, and one of the better tested ones out there.
Yep.
Mitochondrial is also a uniparental type of DNA, but it's the mother who passes that mitochondria down. She will pass it down to her sons and daughters both, but her son will not carry it forward or pass it down. Mitochondrial DNA is actually quite good too. I've been using it some, and Michael actually has a great presentation on Legacy Family Tree webinars, I believe, where he's used it for some German research, I believe, on some matriline ancestors. And the only downside to mitochondrial DNA is it's not a very large piece of DNA in the whole scheme of things, so there's not a lot of change or mutation with it. And what that means is you could end up having someone that's an exact match, but you could end up having to go back 500 years, maybe even 1,000 years. I'm not for sure what the limits are on having an exact match to someone, and you have to go that far back to find that matriline ancestor. So it's something to do for hypothesis testing, to be like, well, these two individuals should have shared the same mitochondrial DNA. We hypothesize they share that same matrilineal ancestor. Let's test them both and see if they do. If they do and it supports, that's great. But if they don't, then something else is occurring. So it's something to use carefully, but I don't want to be dismissive of it either, because I'm finding it to be quite powerful to use in genealogy research as well.
Yeah,
And
and
I think, go
as
ahead.
I'm sorry, as we get to the end of our presentation today and we have open for Q&A, obviously for our group, why DNA is going to be the most important for finding information about how we're all related. Again, because we don't know of everyone here and what your level of experiences with DNA testing. Obviously, like Zach mentioned, why DNA is passed unchanged from father to child to son, father to son, father to son. So, as an example, even though I am deeply involved with Doherty research and my grandfather was a Doherty, I could not test because I'm not a Doherty. I'm a Doherty through my mother. And so I had to get a representative person to test for my Doherty line. Now, luckily, my grandfather was still living when I started doing testing. You can only get Y DNA testing presently at Family Tree DNA. My grandfather since passed away and they've depleted his sample. So for me to now get another representative tester would be to go back further. So my grandfather had a brother, but he's deceased and he only had one daughter. So that strikes out. So I'd have to go back to a great grandparent or a great great grandparent. So if you're a Doherty researcher and you're not a Doherty, or you don't have any Doherty cousins or Doherty aunts and uncles, you have to work back on your tree to find a representative for your family surname. And so that's where we get the bulk of our information on our Doherty study. And in mitochondrial DNA, as Zach mentioned, I use that a lot. It's a little more nuanced and may not bring you a lot of information just for random testing because it's harder to follow because obviously since it's passed only through the mother, we have this horrible habit in Western culture that women lose their surnames. And so that becomes a very difficult one to try to follow. And there's lots of nuances to that. But for the importance of our group, we're going to, go back and talk about why DNA as we move forward. So sorry for the interruption, but we can move from there.
No, it's very useful. I
Okay.
was just going to mention that, and you just explained it very well, but to use these other tests, and I learned a new word, uniparental, so that was good, Zach, thank you. To use these tests to have some of your cousins that you're aware of the relationship with you. For instance, Rosie and I have 3 Doherty lines that we've been able to do the Big Y DNA test on to know where we fit into the Doherty lines. But the 4th Doherty line that we have is a maternal one. And I don't know right now currently of anybody that had a son with the name of Doherty that's connected to us through that line. So I actually found a cousin of mine and we tested her mitochondrial DNA. So far, it hasn't thrown out anything that connects us in there, but I'm hoping that we can at least find something on that couple that is our brick wall, both the husband and the wife in that. We can't do the Y DNA yet, but it is a way to try to break through some of these brick walls that you have.
Well, and it is difficult to find sometimes a representative because now that my grandfather is deceased, now he has an illegitimate son that I could try to get more Y DNA from, who's still alive. But discounting him, with my grandfather deceased, his brother had no kids. His grandfather had brothers who had no kids. So I'd have to take my Doherty line back to 1769 and then move forward on another line to find a representative sample. So although many of us in this group got this, information about this presentation because we belong to the Doherty Association, but so we probably have Dohertys in our near families that we can work with. But again, I have a grandfather who's a Doherty, but still would have to do a Y DNA test on someone very remotely related to find a representative sample. And some people will find that. So to find a representative person to test may be easy or it may not be.
Yeah.
To add to that too, I often will hear someone saying, "Well, I don't know any; they're all passed away," and that's where I encourage descendancy research, going back, what you could reliably go up to and say, again, we're just mentioning Doherty's, but on that line and working out the genealogy of all of his children and then their children, and try to bring that down into the present day, and you'll be surprised what you could find. I mean, it's usually sometimes I hit gold and someone is like, "Oh, I have this cool photo album," when I end up reaching out to some of these individuals they're strangers to me. I mean, they're technically fourth, fifth cousins, but when I do that, I end up then, building that dialogue and sometimes planting the seed of saying, "Hey, would you inherited this individual piece of DNA, this Y DNA from this line? Would you mind testing for me?" And I've done that with, like Michael mentioned, by going back to the 1700s and then back out and down for other surname lines that are outside of my Doherty that I'm Y DNA testing with. So it takes a bit of work, but it usually pays off if you can find those individuals.
Yeah. So I'm going to just share a brief story that goes along with this. Two of our Doherty families. This is Malin Head. If you notice, it's the most northerly point in Ireland. If you're looking for a reference, at the top of the Inishowen Peninsula, the two Doherty families lived 2.3 miles apart, and they said they weren't related. The one from Ballygorman is my great grandfather, and the one from Umgall, which is the bottom, I guess the name isn't on there, I just realized that, but the bottom section was my great grandmother, and both of them were Dohertys. They got married and reared their family up in Ballygorman. And so my dad was told by his father, who was born there and moved to America, that his parents weren't related at all. So that my great grandparents weren't related at all. Well, coming from here and having both surnames, I thought, well, that's really odd. But we didn't know until we got the Y DNA test done from the particular sample people that they are connected about 300 years ago. So that's beyond the sort of known history of the families. And I almost wish I could tell my grandpa that he was wrong in what he told my dad, but he probably already knows it anyways. But that that his grandparents were related to one another back a few hundred years. So that's kind of my little story, and so I'm sure we'll find more of these. I recently connected with a woman who turns out to be a third cousin to Rosie and I. We've been friends for about 20 years doing family history. And it turns out, because she did her dad's DNA, I had done DNA tests, and we both had family trees. We sat down together this last spring and were able to determine that we were third cousins. So that was really fun too. So the DNA was the source of us being able to make that connection. So next, I think, Zach, is you.
Yeah, again, I don't want to deep dive too much into it, but I know some people in this group have done or have tested some individuals that the representative of the Y DNA that they're wanting to look at. But there's two types of mutations, and with that, there's a bunch of different Y DNA tests that family tree DNA cells. The two different types are called YSTRs, which are single tandem repeats, and Y-SNP testing, which they only really have with their more expensive big Y test. But what these are, and this is just an example, is you could see tester 1, 2, and 3, and you're seeing a string of their Y DNA. Well, all men will have, in the world, will have these single tandem repeats that are similar and in the same positions on their Y chromosome for the most part, but they'll have different numbers of them. That sometimes that will get dropped off between a father and son somewhere along the way. So for example, tester 1 has 5 repeats of this STR, this CTA, 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 all in that position. That's 5 right there. Tester 2 has 6 repeats. Tester 3 has 7. So by just looking at that single STR profile there of that single marker, you would assume that the tester 1 and tester 2 are more closely related than, say, 1 and 3, because it seems less likely that you would have 2 drop off or 2 increase, I should say, and really close relationships. So it's more of an assumption, but STRs can be pretty finicky and pretty variable. That's why there's these tests that will test 37, 67, and 111, and the more the better, because you end up having more points of data to compare. Whereas you have the other type of mutation, which is called Y-SNPs, and that's where a single letter, it's not usually a part of those STRs, a single letter shifts And all men on the planet, let's say, will have that A at that position there. Whereas between one father and son, there was a mutation, and that shifted to a T. Now, forever after, for the most part, all of his sons and their sons will have a T at that position, whereas every other male usually has an A. And that's Y SNPs, and they're usually a little bit more powerful, slow to mutate, but a bit more powerful because they serve as strong anchor points to look at over time.
Next
think-
slide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just breaking down the differences between the two, usually the mutation rates between father, son, between those generations is a little bit more frequent or higher for STRs than it is for the Y SNPs. But those Y SNPs are stable, so once they do mutate into position, they're carried on forever after. But those STR, those number of repeats, they could shift up, like that tester one was 5. They could shift up into where it'd be 6, after a grandson, let's say. Many more generations, it could go back down to 5. Well, that gets a little confusing because it's not going in one reliable direction or the other. Whereas the Y SNPs, when they appear in a lineage, they're carried on forever after. And that's usually what you hear about haplogroups. They're based on those Y SNPs, for example. And what we see with family tree DNA is they occur about once every 3 to 5 generations in a male line. And for instance, I figured out that one formed in me that my father doesn't have, for example. So it happens, but it's not always reliable. But it will happen usually in a handful of generations of male lineage. So historically, those Y SNPs have been used for deep ancestry, but now we're finding that we actually can pinpoint recent ones. Like, for example, going back to my father and me, I formed a Y SNP that he does not have. So that's unique to me, and no one else has it. Now, if I have a son and test him, he'll have it, but my dad will not. YSTR testing has usually been for more recent ancestry. Now, I recommend both because then you could apply the Y SNPs first, and then you could apply the STR second. That gives you more data to work with on helping to suss out approximately how closely related you might be on that unique patriline, since it's very unique inheritance. The haplogroup information, it's
Next
based on
slide.
those.
Or no?
No, no. We can go actually. I was just going to. I will cover basically a little bit down to the data stability. Again, the Y SNPs are more stable, and the YSTRs are a bit more variable because they can shift over time. Whereas those SNPs, once they form, that's it. They're stuck in that lineage for the most part. The matching, it can be deep, but it can also be recent with Y SNP testing. But with the STR testing, it's usually more recent. And convergence, that will be a topic for another day. That's something that we happen to have in Irish populations, but it's more of an issue if you get a really well tested group that's related. So, for instance, some of the Doherty lineages that are all matching in the 800 AD, the STRs aren't sufficient to really pull apart how closely they might be related to this Doherty to that Doherty. And that's where the SNP testing also comes into play. And then you could go to the next slide. This is just more like a visual representation of what I mean. So it used to be that Y SNP testing and the haplogroups that 23andMe gives you are pretty far back in time, like 2,000 years ago. But as we are developing higher resolution tests for these sorts of things, we're starting to be able to pull apart lineages, and you could see where you could start to cut that into your known genealogies in the present day when you have enough Y-DNA testers that are tested basically when they're matching, for instance, at a 5th great grandfather or a 6th great grandfather. If you're able to go back that far, if you test those branching descendants, the Y-DNA tests are able to actually show that you have those connections more recent in time than, say, the old past deep ancestry. You could go to the next slide.
Okay. So you want to talk about the
Yeah,
test?
yeah. So going back to the autosomal DNA tests, which there's a lot of companies that do that. Again, Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Living DNA is another one. They're usually dictated, or the most valuable aspect to all those companies, in my opinion, or those platforms, is their database size. Ancestry is the dominant player. It's usually the one I recommend just because of the database size. So you're fishing in a much bigger ocean when you're testing in that company than let's say Living DNA, which I don't know how big their database is, but it's a fraction of the size of Ancestry. I think 23andMe has historically been second, I believe, but again, I'm not for sure the exact numbers that each company has, but it's something to be aware of. A strategy I usually recommend is testing like at the biggest database that doesn't allow imports, and that would be like Ancestry. And then you could take that raw DNA if you like, and you could download it and then upload it to Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and also to a platform called GEDmatch that doesn't do any actual testing. What those do is those are other databases you could then find new matches in that are only in that pond or in that database. So that's something to be aware of when doing some of these tests. The regional specificity, actually, I'm not for sure what you might have in mind for that, Eva. I guess.
Well, yeah, just to make sure that the database includes the region you're looking at. And I think for Irish genealogy, they do. But for some people who are looking for a more specific small region, you need to investigate to make sure that the company you're looking at testing with has a sample population to draw from.
Yeah, I'll just throw in there, like what Zach said. I mean, Ancestry's got by far the biggest number of testers. And so when you're doing autosomal DNA, remember that reflects all of your ancestors on both your mother's and father's side. And so you can find more meaningful matches if you've got more people testing. Zach did mention 23andMe has a lot of testers. 23andMe is having some business instability recently, like their entire board of directors has quit. So I would hesitate to test with them right now until we know that they're going to be still a stable company, which is unfortunate. But if you're doing, and then autosomal DNA, like Eva mentioned, for example, MyHeritage is not a huge database, but they have a kind of a much stronger European, more mainland Europe testing group, because they're based actually in Israel, I believe. So they're just testing a little bit of a different population, but you can test at multiple places, and you can test at Ancestry. You can download your raw data and you can upload it to MyHeritage. So there are some sites that will take your test results from other testers. Ancestry only takes Ancestry. So because they're kind of bigger population of testers and they don't take imports, that's probably also my first recommendation for testing.
Yeah, great.
I want to try to address a question or someone asked about the relationship between Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage. They understand that MyHeritage does not accept big Y data to upload. Yeah, no company really, for the most part, will take Y-DNA uploads. It's usually just all autosomal. There's GEDmatch, which takes usually autosomal DNA from any platform to allow it to compare, between platforms. But there is a MitoYDNA.org is sort of a platform, sort of like GEDmatch, that allows you to upload results. They won't do testing, but they'll allow you to upload your STR markers or some of your big Y data. But it's not really something at the level of where enough people have done it to have a great value. It's still better to be in that database unique to Y-DNA, which really, like Michael mentioned, is Family Tree DNA for the most part, that will have that database of comparisons for Y-DNA and mitochondrial.
And definitely have that's the only the only reasonable place you're going to do Y-DNA testing. And we have a great Y-DNA Doherty database, and we have a great project manager, so you can't lose.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I would say then on the user experience with these test. For example, I'm a little biased against 23andMe just because I've only done one test on there, but they've not really developed their tool set to help with genealogy on that much. So I usually find it a little frustrating because it doesn't really encourage a lot of people to build out a tree, let's say, or anything like that. So you got to reach out to each person and talk with them. So to me, the user experience with the company is very important. Ancestry has made a lot of cool strides and improvements since I started in 2016 with them. A little frustrated sometimes with some paywall features, but that's just the way businesses are with some of that. But I do think that they have a good user experience, and I really do like the tools at MyHeritage actually. Um, uh, they offer a pretty good user experience as well. It's just the database size is not quite the same. Um, Community and support. There is a lot of Facebook groups. I know that Kathleen Travers here linked one earlier for Inishowen DNA matches, and I do recommend discussing, or if you're into any social media, finding some of these groups to talk about and learn about some of these testing features and how you might be related to some individuals. Uh, in terms of company support, all I could say, at least with like my experience with Family Tree DNA, is I'm a volunteer administrator for like the Doherty project, so I try to take some time to help individuals who spend money on the, say, a Y-DNA test, help them understand their interpretations, how to interpret their results. I unfortunately don't have the time to help with like delving into the genealogy. I rarely have enough to help do it for my own self, but I could quickly usually figure out some Y-DNA results, or at least find some ways to explain that. So there are different support structures out there to help understand some of these results. Privacy and security, that's something that all these companies have. They have a terms of service. You could read that. Usually on the autosomal front, they will ask, and you could uncheck or opt out or opt in if you want to participate for where they will gather your data, anonymize it, and in huge batches of anonymous people, they will do research with it for pharmaceuticals. I'm not particularly knowledgeable about that. There are resources you could go out and read on that, but that's it's something that you could usually opt out of in all these companies. So I really am not familiar enough to discuss that much beyond that. Accuracy and scientific rigor. The tests, like the autosomal tests, are only looking at approximately 0.03% of our genome. Now, that's targeting a part of the genome that we are showing relationships to one another to. So otherwise, we're actually quite common, like 98% identical DNA or even higher. I forget the exact amount, but it's not measuring every bit of our genome. So there's usually sometimes a misnomer that I don't want my whole genome out there. Well, these companies aren't doing that. But they are pretty accurate, and it will depend on the type of test you're talking about, and what your goals are to ask of that data. But I don't know if you want to explain any more on the scientific rigor or accuracy, Eva, because
No, it's just there are some questions that I've gotten when I've done a presentation about that, and I've just encouraged people to do research on the company themselves if they're concerned about them. So I think this list were just questions that had come up to me in previous presentations that I felt would be addressed. So I think we've covered those. The last slide that I have on here is talking about just a few places where you can get other information. But I was also wondering, Zach, if you had any other ideas, and then Michael, I wondered if you could speak for just a couple of minutes about the things that you know from the classes that you've done with the family tree stuff, and also with Roots Tech. So because there's a lot of resources out there available. I don't know, Zach, do you want to?
Uh,
What do you recommend for people?
Well, really, there is a lot of great free resources out there. YouTube, there's a lot of individuals that put out some great videos. For instance, when I was first getting into Y-DNA, I was really enjoying reading in the mid 2000s or watching presentations given for uh, um, it was a Irish genetic genealogy conferences, and I enjoyed watching those. They're pretty informative, and they will also cover all the gamut of the tests we've discussed here. So Y-DNA, mitochondrial even, and autosomal, but put into the confines or within the boundaries of sort of talking about Irish specific DNA. So you could find all kinds of conference presentations like that for free on YouTube.
Mhm.
In terms of Y-DNA, there's a good book by, and I took an image earlier in a slide from David Vance on Y-DNA testing and using it for genetic genealogy. Another good book that I recommend, and I forget the title of it, unfortunately, off the top of my head, would be like Blaine Bettinger's book on DNA testing. Um, it's got genetic genealogy in the title. It escapes my mind right now, but those are good resources as well if you want a physical book to read. Um, uh, and yeah, really, YouTube. I do recommend. It does cost money, $50 a year, but you have hundreds, if not 1,000 or more, presentations on any topic you could think of, even specific to certain record sets in Kentucky, let's say, or DNA or anything from family tree webinars, which Michael actually has 2 or 3 presentations on, one about mitochondrial DNA case study. So that's another good resource as well. I could probably get links to email out some of those, or
Well, that'd be great. If you got them to me, I'd add them to when I send out the
Yeah.
link to the video, then I'll add those on there too.
Yeah.
Michael, what do you want to speak to some of those resources? Promote yourself a little
Yeah.
bit here.
What's that?
Promote yourself a little bit here.
Well, so I mean, Zach mentioned, and I didn't come prepared with a bibliography, but Blaine Bettinger's books are really good. But there's just, DNA as a tool for research has been out long enough that there's a slew of Facebook groups, lots of things on a legacy family tree. Like I give a mitochondrial DNA study on there. But just in recap, for our group, for the Doherty project, Y-DNA is going to be where we need to focus. But there's lots and lots of good Y-DNA lectures and YouTube videos out there. So there's not really one that I say is like the go-to. I mean, play around. There's plenty of resources online. Eva mentioned that Roots Tech is coming up in March.
I think so.
Roots Tech, if you're not familiar with that, is a very, very, very large international conference that's based in Salt Lake City. I'll be lecturing in person there in Salt Lake this coming March, although not on any DNA topics. But they also sell a virtual registration as well. And it's an enormous conference, but they cover many, many, many topics. And many of those topics are kind of broad overviews since they want to kind of relate to as many people as possible. And I've not looked at their lineup yet, but I'm sure they've got a ton of Irish research. They probably have a ton of DNA. And I'm sure a lot of those will be for some of you who are just starting or kind of getting your feet wet. There may be a lot of good programs there. So look at that coming up and think about doing a registration. But I guess I didn't make the introduction. I'm a professional researcher, so I'm a professional genealogist and have a Doherty ancestor. So I'm invested in this, and I do a lot of lecturing on DNA. So it is a perfect match, research DNA and a Doherty grandfather. So I babble a lot with Zach on the Y-DNA project, but I will not become an administrator because I let him do all the heavy lifting and I just sit back and ask all the questions. And reap from his experience.
Yeah. And why don't you just say a little bit about the next class that we're looking to do probably in January?
So again, with the Doherty name, and Zach alluded to this, is that you've got two types of Y-DNA testing. You've got the STR testing, which is what family tree DNA sells as their Y111, and I don't even know they sell a Y67 anymore. I think they sell a Y37, which is going to be a very little help for Doherty's. So here's the problem. If we are Doherty's, we descend from and hold a surname that's been around since the 11th century or earlier. And so unlike Millers or Potters or Smiths, where there are multiple people living on this planet with a surname from various backgrounds because of their occupational names, all Dohertys technically are related. Because we all descend from one Irish tribe. And so sometimes the Y11 is not enough. And so we got to do a deeper dive. So the SNP testing, the big Y test, is what was previously advertised as deep testing, but we need deep testing to split apart our Doherty lineages. And the unfortunate thing is that the big Y test comes with a heftier price tag. But it is so much more important, especially with the loss of early Irish records, to try to find where we connect on a deeper level. If you find, much like Eva mentioned, you've got multiple Dohertys in your ancestry. Well, how closely are they related? Well, sometimes you run out of paperwork to prove or disprove your lineage, and you need DNA to kind of make that happen. And sometimes Y-DNA can tell you that, oh, our lines converge 200 years ago, or our lines converge 700 years ago. And as the project gets bigger and bigger, we can now form a more accurate tree on how closely we're all related, even though we all carry the same surname. So the big Y testing is what's going to become more important. And hopefully with our next class, I'll be running that, and we'll do a deeper dive on Y-DNA with some examples. It gets a little bit technical, but it will help you understand where big Y testing will be so important for furthering the Doherty project.
Yes, thank you. So just sort of in closing, I just want to recap. With all family history research, you need to consider the accuracy of the information that you find online. Take the time with your tests, particularly autosomal ones like in Ancestry or 23andMe, to mark down what you know the relationship is between you and the other person. That can get to be a little bit time consuming to do it, but it's very well worth it, so that you know whether they are a second cousin twice removed, and whatever the relationship is. Investigate as best you can the listed sources. Ask the people where you're getting this information from what their sources are. Compare that with other evidence that you have. I do recommend that you contact other researchers to collaborate and confirm their findings. I have found that some people get a little territorial with their family trees. So I also like to remind everybody that with your siblings, of course, you share parents, but with your first cousins, you share grandparents, second cousins, you share great-grandparents, third cousins, you share second great-grandparents. So by the time you get to where someone is a third, fourth, fifth cousin, there's a lot of people who are a part of that very same tree. So yes, you might have done the research to find what you have, but I recommend we share information with one another, because we are all related. So this is our last slide. Don't give up. Keep digging. Ask questions. Follow up. Expect that the Luck of the Irish will bring you the pot of gold. And Rosie was going to put in the chat for the link to sign up to get a notification for our next class. Yes, it is putting you on our mailing list. So just be aware of that. So it's the Association of O'Doherty's. Our email is on there. You all use that to sign up for the class. The website that we're using to collect people's family trees is the o'dohertyassociation.org. So you can look at our website too and send us an email if you have any questions. So any last comments, Zach or Michael, and then we can open up for questions.
I do want to reiterate on Eva's last slide about being very cautious on online trees. I mean, use the online databases to help you with your research. Don't just tag onto someone's tree. If you have a Doherty tree that takes you back to the 13th century, it's likely wrong and not proven. It's great to feel like you've gotten your line back that far, but there are going to be very, very, very few Irish resources that really make that tree true. And especially if you're joining the YDNA Doherty project, it will ask you what your most distant known ancestor is. If you put a name from the 13th century, one, it's not proven, and two, it doesn't help us link people together. So even if you only know the name of your grandfather or your great-grandfather, that is going to be more accurate information for your most distant known ancestor, because we want to know that it's known and not that you've plugged into someone's lineage that has lots and lots and lots of doubts. So very important to go with what you know and not what someone else told you on the internet, unless they can prove it.
I would love to have a cousin show up and have the genealogy back to the 1300s. That would be awesome.
If you've got a Doherty lineage back that far, unfortunately, it's probably not correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, questions?
I would just encourage everyone on the call, if you haven't already, to check the chat, because many of the questions that were put in there, our presenters took the time to answer them in real time. So there's some great things in there. And I would say that since Eva's kind of opened up the mic, if there's something that wasn't answered in the chat and you want to bring it up, I see somebody, Doherty D, just posted about staying with Pat Doherty. And the things about inaccuracy. So I don't know if that.
I'm going to address that. I saw that.
Yeah.
Really. So I was a great friend of Pat's and never did stay with him because we always had our kids with us and way too much room. But he did an amazing service to the clan by going around for years. Once he retired, he moved over there and he would visit with people, older people in their homes, and write down the family tree information, the oral history. And a lot of genealogists are a little bit poo-poo about oral history, but we have to remember that Irish genealogy was oral history. That's how it was kept. So was the stories that were kept. So there are people who know their history back, for hundreds of years. And Michael and I were sort of talking a little bit back and forth about that. It's not able to prove it, but I certainly do. Whatever the oral traditions were that the older people told me, I have written them down and kept them, and many times have found them to be true. There's a lot more information now, not only just with YDNA, but with all the online databases and the sources that we have available to us. And yes, unfortunately, there are inaccuracies in some of the things that Pat put together in his big tree. I have a copy of the tree. I haven't ever taken the time really to go in and try to prove it and check the accuracy. It has about 120,000 names in it, and I just have been going forward with what I have and what I know from the proofs that I can find. So maybe at some point, if we ever get enough fundraising and funding going on and grants and stuff, we can see what can be done to check the accuracy of that. But basically, if you're doing your own research and you're checking on those things and you want to join with what we're doing of collecting trees, then we can try to have accuracy. But I personally don't have time to check someone else's accuracy in their tree. So anyways, that's sort of it.
Yeah, Eva, somebody's asking if Paddy's research is accessible, and Rosie said that you've worked closely with them and you've got access to it.
I have a copy of his tree, yes, but unfortunately there is a lot of inaccuracies in it, so I don't use it. His son Cameron, before he passed away, gave it to me to keep, so I have it, but I haven't come up with a project yet to be able to research it. So, but for people who contributed to his tree, if you give us a GEDCOM of your family tree, we can put it on our website, which is a member-based website. People have to get approved to have access to it, and then it would be searchable there for people. So it's the best answer we have right now. If someone wants to email me separately, if they have another idea or if they want to help take on the project, we're happy to have volunteers. We've been meeting as a sort of clan leadership group once a month for a little over a year now thinking of things that we can do to move this clan association forward. So we're always talking about this. I do want to take note of someone on here, Bob Doherty, who was really helpful in getting involved initially with the YDNA project, has joined us today, and I just wanted to give Bob a shout out because
I have to apologize. I got tied up in another meeting and just had to zoom back home. But I have to give a shout out to Zach, because Zach, I had bypass surgery in 2018 and a couple of other medical issues since then that caused me to kind of back out. But Zach, you have taken the YDNA stuff to a whole new level, far beyond where I could. And I'm now that I've passed through a medical era, I think I'm coming back on board with this stuff again. And I just want to say, apologize for being late checking in on this, but I'm looking forward to seeing where this goes.
I also want to make an initial announcement that I'm working closely with a group of people in Inishowen that are trying to create a heritage center. It wouldn't just be the Doherty clan, it would be all clans of Inishowen and all cultural heritage of Inishowen. So I'm super excited about that project, and we hope that it comes to fruition even within the next year, that there's a building and a center, and these things can be pulled together. So anyways, that's our clan breaking news. Yeah.
Yeah, I was amazed when I started with the YDNA back in 2005. We had 8 people, and today there's 930 something people, and it's amazing how far we've come. But it also, you touched on, I think Mike was talking about, even though you have a Doherty name, you don't know how close you're related to the other Dohertys. And I'll tell you, my great grandfather was a James Doherty, and there are a gazillion James Dohertys. And making sure you get the right one is a challenge, but it's an interesting quest.
Yeah, I think with the big Y testing, I think Zach and our lines are split by something like 700 years or something like that. Like we're not closely related.
No, even though we have John Doherty's, lots of John
Yeah,
Doherty's.
lots
in it.
Yeah.
Well, my grandfather was John, and his father was James, and James and
Yeah.
Chris keep alternating back and forth.
Yeah.
Well, and
Yeah.
Eva made a good point. It's like, you never want to discount oral history, because oral history is amazing. Like there are things that our families know either from personal experience that passes when they pass, or that they've carried down through generations. But the Irish were not very creative at naming their children. So if you've got the wrong John or the wrong James or the wrong Patrick, or the wrong Bridget, interspersed within the tree, you can make a bad turn even with good family history, oral history. So that's where DNA and good research works together. So. Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
Michael, would you say a little thing about the Michael Moore tree that we've been trying to
Oh yes, for any of you doing American Doherty research, so my line goes back to the 18th century in this country, in the United States. Well, before it was the United States. So for whatever reason, someone it's gotten to become the running goal to reach this Michael Moore individual who lived in Virginia in the 18th century. And I don't know why, maybe because there's an erroneous tree that was published in the 80s that took his line back to the 13th century, which is all wrong. But it's become like this race to the finish line that everyone needs to connect to this one single Doherty individual that lived in the 18th century Virginia. Not only did this Michael Moore person not exist in the form that people present him as, they've actually taken a conglomeration of multiple Michaels and turned them into one. But they have this fictitious Michael coming from Ireland with 3 kids, and none of that's based in fact. The Michael in question was a single man living in Pennsylvania before he went to Virginia. So it's been the race to the finish for people to connect to this fictitious individual. And Zack likes to tease me with every snippet of information that comes through the association or through the YDNA project where people seem to connect to him. It's just one example where bad research tends to take on a life of its own, and it's a warning to not cut and paste without critical assessment of what you're looking at.
Yep. Yeah.
You know, on a personal note, my mother passed away when she was 57, and so my 86-year-old grandmother came to help my father raise my brother and I. And when I was about 13, I sat down and I asked the question, how come I don't call him Uncle Jim, but she does? She calls him Uncle Jim because he's not your uncle. He's your cousin. Well, how are we all related? 3 of my grandparents were born in Ireland. And my grandmother, my father's mother, who was actually Molly Sullivan before she became Molly Doherty, she knew the names of everybody. And I sat down, I said, well, what are the names of your brothers and sisters? Well, there were 10 of them. And so I wrote them down. And then, well, how about Bumpa's name? His brothers and sisters. He was one of 10 brothers and sisters. And then she knew the maternal side of the family, all the 10 brothers and sisters in those families. But the problem I have is 3 of my grandparents were born in Ireland. The Dohertys, my grandfather was born in Cascade, Wisconsin, and his father was born in what is now Toronto, Canada. And then his father was born in Ireland. So I've been back to Ireland and I've been talking to cousins on the 3 branches that are not Dohertys. I've been to the old homesteads of the 3 branches that are not Dohertys, but I have yet to find where exactly in Ireland the Dohertys came from. And, you know, I go back to James Doherty, who was born in 1797, I think it was 79 or 97. I have to look it up again, but I don't know where. You know, so that's always the challenge. And so I'm on the never-ending search for my Doherty starting point.
And just to go off of that too, like with Eva, she shared that image of 2 different Doherty lines she tested, and they were 2 to 3 miles apart. You know, and it's more than likely, and given that their Y-DNA was close enough to be within the last 300 years or so, that they did share a common ancestor that likely lived at least regionally to there, if you want to take that hypothesis and make it. And when you are testing all these lineages at a high enough resolution, you could start to build like heat maps where you could sort of see where the most distant known ancestors on these different lines that are matching sort of were in a various region. And that sort of gives you something where there's no written record, and it helps build a bit of information or draw back the veil a little bit on where there's no information before to really take you there. So
Yeah.
there is hope, to sort of make these things. Now you might not have, the next 5 generations added to your tree, but because we don't have that written down somewhere, but it gives you something interesting to go off of, in my opinion.
Yeah, where deep Irish ancestry is very difficult to attain in like the typical born married, died, a deep Y-DNA testing can put you on the tree of the Doherty family that gives meaning to your place amongst the clan, without having the availability of records that become so sparse, not only in Ireland, but in any place as you go back far enough.
Well, even a more recent, Zack and I are only 3 steps apart. That's going to be 6 steps apart. But you've got Charles Doherty on your tree that is only 2 steps apart from me.
Right. I had a lot more mutations.
How do we get
that
than
he did. So, but he's 2 generations higher than me as a known cousin. So he had less mutations on his Y chromosome than I did. So he shows up as more closely related to you than I do, even though we go through the same ancestor, him and I. So that's an example of that's more of like the next sort of class of Michael talks about STR testing, where it could get a little murky if you're only going off of STRs. So, But yeah, Bob and I happen to be each other's closest match beyond our brick wall ancestors, and
Yeah.
I just
Well-
randomly came across that.
Yeah, and
Hey,
we
cousin, good to see you.
yeah, when we
Well-
do a deeper dive on Y-DNA, we can talk about what those matches mean and how they can help you with your research.
Well, and that will be helpful. Patty Doherty, who's on this call, is a cousin to the Y-DNA test we did on Declan, Zach.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So for instance, would it be useful for Patty or his sons or whatever to do the Y-DNA because his cousin Declan has already done it?
I usually say if you're like a first cousin or something, it's not the best expenditure of resources in my mind to do an exhaustive Y-DNA test for like brothers or cousins. I say go up to your brick wall as high up as you could go, do that descendancy research down, find another line, that's unbroken male line, test that, and then you could develop all the mutations that that brick wall ancestor that you split away from had. And then you could compare that lineage to these other lineages. And really what you're kind of doing is you're sort of almost testing that brick wall ancestor in a way. I don't want to get too complicated, but I've done this with like my brick wall ancestor died in 1808 and he had 3 sons. I've tested descendants of each 3, and I've sort of built up what that brick wall ancestor's Y chromosome looked like, and now I can compare that to other lineages. I know that all the mutations that occurred since him and all the ones that he had that by doing that. So if you ever try to test more in your known family, it's better to try to do it as far back as you can reliably go with your genealogy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so Patty, it would make more sense, I think, if we got a hold of one of the Newmans and tested one of them as opposed to doing any of the organs. So that, yeah. Again,
Zach,
I'm talking nicknames. Sorry.
so I posted a message. I posted in the chat because the only living male in our family from our Dohertys is my brother. So I wondered whether it would be worth getting him to do Y-DNA.
I think it
So
would.
my grandfather was a Doherty. My father was adopted. So really, my brother's the only one remaining that's likely going to be able to join that project. So I think, would it be worth getting him to do the Y-DNA?
Yeah, and so so with your father being adopted, he still has the Doherty, your father had the Doherty DNA? I can't remember your.
No. So my dad isn't related to Doherty.
So your
He has
brother
no
wouldn't be.
relation. But my granddad on mother's side was Doherty.
So your
Yeah,
brother
Jeff-
would. Oh, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think we're all going to say the same thing. You'd have to go up because if your father's adopted and he's not biologically a Doherty, he will not have the Doherty Y-DNA. So
Okay.
if your grandfather was Doherty, you'll have to go to a grandfather's brother and then down. And if there's none
Right.
of those, you got to go back up another generation and down. So yeah, you've got
Okay.
all of that Y-DNA biological line. Yes.
Right. Okay. So that might be possible actually, because we've got quite a few people who were biologically related. So I'll check into that and get back to you guys and see if we can do something.
Yeah, and it's something I've done a lot. Most all the people that I've target tested, and usually I end up paying for it. Sometimes they'll be interested enough that they will chip in or pay for it, but they're really distant cousins that are strangers to me completely. Like, because I'm going so far back and then doing that descendancy research to come back down. But then I try to explain as best as I can, like, hey, this DNA is not too. It's unique enough, but it's not too personal, let's say, if they have privacy concerns, because again, brothers, first cousins can have identical Y-DNA where they look like they're the identical individuals. But I will then make the case of like saying, hey, you could help with trying to drive that rigid spine that we're wanting to track back on that patriline, and you uniquely inherited it, and I don't have it, and usually it works. I've done it for other surnames on my ancestral lines, and it's pretty rewarding usually for both parties, to be honest.
I give a whole lecture on how to persuade strangers to spit. So if you get to be like DNA nutcases like Zach and I, then we can go that route, because I've also asked lots and lots of strangers to donate DNA to help solve problems.
So I'm looking
can we
for
do
a
that class
Doherty
next?
descendant.
What's that?
I'm looking for a granddad's. I'm looking for a male, a son of granddad. Somebody a male descended from a son of granddad.
Yeah.
That would do it. Yeah. So that's what I need to look for. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And they usually will, Kathleen, they'll usually have the Doherty surname, but
Yeah.
we have a few people in our study who do not have the Doherty surname because the event happened back in their ancestry where the biological father was Doherty, but the surname that was passed to the child was not Doherty. So,
Okay.
so that's another thing too. When you said the word adopted, that's why Zach and Michael and I went,
that goes back to the McDivotts, who were, David O'Doherty was a clan chief, but then they took the son of David McDivitt as opposed to continuing Doherty, but they're genetically, they're a branch of the Dohertys.
yes,
Don't mention McDade's to me.
Yeah, McDade's, McDevitt, same family. Yes.
Yeah.
Don't mention McDade's to me.
But that's a good
yeah, I'll look and see if I can do that, Zach.
Yeah.
So that's a good point, where some of the deeper Y-DNA testing has shown that, the tradition that the McDevitts were actually Dohertys, and that's holding true with these deep Y-DNA testing.
Exactly.
So we're seeing where certain surnames branched off of the main Doherty line and by tradition, but it's holding up through Y-DNA study.
Mhm.
Yeah. And there's the story too about McCallions, and I don't know if that has shown in there that the McCallions were.
I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, I haven't
I
seen
mean,
it
it
yet
could
either.
still happen, but it's again not the most popular DNA tests. It's becoming more popular, but I mean, as people are looking to add it to their toolbox, we're starting to see some more interesting things. Like there's a type of branch of McCaffreys, and if you go back into the annals, the Irish annals, they talk about a sept of McCaffreys that were Dohertys, but they took that surname, and we actually have 3 Y-DNA testers now right smack dab in the middle that are matching around 1200 AD to the rest of the Dohertys on that line. So it's kind of interesting, and there's bigger groups out there that are taking some of the surnames like O'Donnell, Boyle, and stuff, and seeing how they're aligning with Dohertys, and seeing how those surnames cluster. That's further back in time, of course, to way beyond anything that there's written history besides some of these annals. But it's interesting to see how they are clustering, like some of those ancient genealogies are stating to be.
Yeah. Well, I love it when science matches what we have as the oral tradition. So
Right. It's like the simplest one was, I did my brother's testing. We're identical. Oh, surprise, surprise. But, I found more people I wasn't looking for originally. I got an interest because of Doherty, but my brother-in-law passed away, and my wife is his twin, and they never knew their father. And his estate went into probate, and we had to prove that he didn't have any descendants. And because of the research I had been doing parallel to my Doherty research, I'd done Windham, which was his name. And through that process, when they turned it over to a genetic research company to do the research, were there any other potential errors? They said, well, we found one person based upon the information I gave the research company, and it could be one of 2 people. And I said, well, see if you can get them to do the DNA test, and I'll pay for it. And I did. And my wife now has a first cousin she never knew she had, but it was on the female side, and it wasn't a direct descendant. So that solved the probate issue. So this
The
stuff
impor-
comes in handy in other things just than DNA research.
The unfortunate thing we should have brought up sooner, as people are filtering out, is that a disclaimer is that anytime you engage in DNA testing, be it both for yourself or through testing relatives, you have to be cautious. You will run into those surprises.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
You may find out that your daddy ain't your daddy, or your granddaddy ain't your granddaddy, or you may contact a cousin to test for you and find out that his daddy ain't his daddy, and then you're in a world of discomfort. So that is always a disclaimer when doing DNA testing, is that you may create surprises for yourself or for others. So be prepared.
Exactly. I had done my autosomal DNA, and I got a text email message from Ancestry from the last name Chidgey, Chidgey. He says, "How come you're my closest blood relative in this autosomal testing? I'm not Irish, you know." And well, I did a little research, and I found out that I had a cousin back down up my tree who went over to England as a boarder before he went to America. And yes, you are related. And sorry to say that your ancestor was not who you thought he was.
Yeah, those events did happen. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I think that, people are going to have skeletons in their closets, and, the people that came before us were all just human, and, we just move along with that. Rosie and I have recently learned of two people that were born out of wedlock that have come into the family as cousins. And it's really exciting. I got to meet both of them last summer, and I loved it. Rosie and I met a first cousin of ours about 25 years ago that we didn't know our uncle had a child. So, those kind of things happen, and it can just sort of add to your family.
Yeah,
Anyway.
and on my side, I mentioned my dad was adopted, and DNA brought me to his grandparents. So they had 3 sons, and one of those sons was my granddad. Might never know which one, but I've found cousins all over the world, and I knew who my grandparents were. So DNA has been marvelous for me, and yeah, it's opened up a whole new world.
Yep. Yeah. Well, does anybody have any other questions or comments yes, Bob?
Question I have is sorry I came in late, an hour late. I apologize, but how frequently are you going to have these Zoom meetings? Or
Well, the initial thought was once a quarter, so next January. So, and if it seems like there's a big interest and there's volunteers to help put on the class, then we could do it, more often than that as well. So I think there'd be interest. I was just going to mention too that speaking about Zoom things, Kathleen runs a Facebook page that has a once a month Zoom meeting about genealogy research. And we end up talking about other things too. But do you want to talk for just a minute about your Facebook page and your Zoom meeting?
Yeah, it's called the South Inishowen Family History Group. And we're focused very much on South Inishowen because there's so many interconnections there. So there's a Facebook group, and basically we just thought it's not a huge group, but we all work very well together and help each other out. And once a month we have a Zoom meeting, and whoever's around can come in and have a chat, and then we can start looking at any questions, how can we help each other. And we started that group during COVID, and it's still running. So it's not huge, but because we're focused in a very small area, then it works very well. And we've figured out how quite a few of us are related to one another, except Eve and I are still struggling with that one.
Yeah, we don't know that yet.
We don't know that yet, but we do have lots of connections just in that small group. So hang on, I'll just find the link and I'll stick it in if anybody's interested in joining. There's also another group called the Inishowen Donegal DNA Matches group, which is a much bigger group, and both groups are very active. So I'll stick the link in for that one as well.
And partly the reason why we're mentioning Inishowen is because that actually is where most of the Doherty people are, although the
Yeah.
west of Donegal has Doherty in it as well. But although Caharua, the last chieftain, was killed in West Donegal, but most of the time he spent in the castles in Inishowen. So
Yeah, so there's a lot. We've got the South Inishowen itself seems to be a very peculiar place in some ways, because everybody's connected to everybody else, and sometimes it's just interesting to find out, like, okay, I've got a DNA match with this person in the group, and we can not figure it out, as with Eva. But the main thing about the group is, I think, trying to help one another do research.
yeah.
And that's one of the unique selling points of that group, is it's small, but it's focused in a small area, and it's about helping each other. So we've made some breakthroughs on it. So please
And the
join
inter-
if you would like to.
Yeah, the interesting thing too is if you ask Kathleen specifically what is the geographic boundary of South Inishowen, she invites you to come to the group.
Yeah,
she hasn't been that particular as to the exact geographic boundaries
No.
of South Inishowen.
Basically, anyone in the show is going to be related to other people in the show, and so
Absolutely.
yeah. But
Yeah.
we've made quite a few breakthroughs in the last few years in that group. Found cousins,
Yeah.
made friends. So yeah,
Yeah.
feel free to come along if it's going to be something that's interesting to you.
Yep. So I've kind of exhausted all of my things on my list. Does anybody have any other things they feel like they need to?
New message.
Yeah, and that's our next class. We're expected to do a deeper dive into the Y-DNA. So
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Yeah. So someone's
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
yeah,
Go ahead, Mike.
on someone's comment, when we do a deeper dive into Y-DNA, I give a lot of examples from the Doherty project. So that'll kind of help
Okay.
you walk through what those matches mean.
Okay.
And that's probably January. Our next meeting is in 2 weeks for our association leadership. And so we will plan the calendar at that point. We just kind of roughly said January. So, and it's
Yeah.
after Christmas. So I don't know, so much can happen between now and Christmas. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm ready to call it if anybody doesn't have any more comments or questions or.
I'm good.
Yeah. And Eileen, I'm jealous if you're in Inishowen. I left there, 2
Yeah.
weeks ago. So
Oh, it's
Kathleen and I met
great
over
finally
dinner.
seeing you guys after it's been so long.
I know,
Yeah.
Bob.
I missed the 2015 reunion because of my grandson's graduation, and I missed
Yeah.
the 2020 because of the
We canceled it.
pandemic.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And Jennifer Doherty is doing an event. It is not part of the association, but she's still organizing an event that people can come to. It's a part of her travel company. And so my thought is more power to her for that. So the people that were in the leadership in the Clann Association just felt like there wasn't the room to do that anymore. It was hard to run it as a volunteer thing. Of
So
course, that you helped me when we first met, when you,
yeah,
I told you
yes,
right in, you're helping.
always a
Bob.
challenge. All volunteers welcome, right?
Yes, yes. So
Is there going to be a 2025?
there is, Jennifer is running an event through her tour company. Yes.
Okay.
But it is not an Doherty Clann reunion.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
we're not doing those anymore. We're kind of leaning towards even maybe having meetups like this where people would want to meet up on a Zoom call that maybe wouldn't be a class and see how that goes. That's kind of the things we're throwing out to do some classes, to do some meetups. One of our leader members goes and goes to Celtic festivals and has a tent there. And so some people are looking at doing some of that to go to a local, you know, Celtic festival and have a tent and talk about the association. And so anyways, so there's things happening and things moving forward, but the work required to put on that event, I think having a tour company do it for people that want to go to Ireland that are of the Doherty surname, that's great. The locals there never really wanted to participate very much in it. It was more of a tourism thing anyways. So I think it makes sense to go that direction. So
Yeah.
so yes, Jennifer is doing something in July. I don't know the dates, but I did see something, and people keep emailing me, and I keep telling them to contact her. So I'm working on
Eva,
it.
Eva, we should be promoting the association when we're in Ireland doing our Clonmany things and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
So it'd be worth thinking about, you know, how can we do more to promote the association,
yeah.
and the groups that we're in will help with that.
Yeah, and I think that the more people that are getting interested in heritage, that's why I think this Heritage Center will be
Yeah.
a good thing. It will be a place where we can utilize their employees on site and tell them about our association and stuff, and it won't be something that our association will have to fund completely, you know.
Yeah.
So I
Good.
think that that's going to be a really good thing. Yeah.
Eva, Zach, Rosie, thanks very much for this. Very informative. So almost as important as what you can do at the ANA is what you cannot do. So some really good qualifications on I'll have to draw the dotted line on the work that Pat did for my dad. But it's just really good practices to be reminded of. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much.
Daniel, why are you always in your car?
Seems to be, yeah, I'm in Vancouver today. I'm just between some things, and yeah, busy doing stuff.
Okay,
Man.
well,
Good man. Good
Yeah.
man.
then we'll see you in 2 weeks, right, Dad?
Yeah. Cheers.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Okay, folks.
Great
Thanks,
seeing you
everybody.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.